Hello, and thank you for tuning in. Today's Friday. We're going to end the week with Federalist number 15, titled The Inefficiency of the Present Confederation to Preserve the Union. It's written by Alexander Hamilton, December 1st, 1787. Topics include main inefficiencies of the Articles of Confederation and the lack of a law enforcement system. And also, trying to, I guess this is another topic that's a little off base, but trying to figure out the relationship between the federal government and the state government. Now, this entire paper, it is a long one. It is very deep. I have a lot of deep quotes, very long quotes, kind of hard to break down. And what Hamilton does here is he explains the inefficiencies of the Articles of Confederation in terms of its relation to state governments. It did not give a apparatus to collect money for revenues. It did not find a way to build a military effectively. It was almost like the Articles of Confederation, and it's the way he explains it in this paper, is it was more of a treaty, or rather an alliance between the states that did not really create a federal government. It just created a treaty, almost like the UN, like how we have these UN conferences, like a conference like that. You just have individuals that represent each state showing up at this conference, which they called the Congress. So from this paper, there is going to be from 15 to 22 to Federalist paper number 22. They're all going to be dedicated to the defects of the Articles of Confederation. And Hamilton begins this paper by alluding to his preceding papers as endeavored to give a clear and convincing light on the importance of the continuance of America through union. And then he continues with the inability of the current system to pay debts, keep a military, partake in treaties, create a treasury and a government, and engage in commerce through waterways without a threat of foreign attack. Now, in general, he calls the present Articles of Confederation inefficient, and he states, and I quote, "The facts that support this opinion are no longer objects of speculation. They have forced themselves upon the sensibility of the people at large, and have at length extorted from those whose mistaken policy has had the principal share in precipitating the extremity at which we are arrived, a reluctant confession of the reality of those defects in the scheme of our federal government, which have been long pointed out and regretted by the intelligent friends of the Union," end quote. So you're pretty much saying that, the Articles of Confederation have been found inefficient. I don't remember if he actually, let's see, I don't think he says it here, but I read it. The people that are his dissenters do not agree with, they do agree with him that it is ineffective and inefficient, but I think he alludes to it later, and I do have a quote about it. It is they believe it is ineffective and inefficient as well, but they don't agree with the proposed Constitution as a fix to this issue. Now he continues, "We may indeed with propriety be said to have reached almost the last stage of national humiliation. There is scarcely anything that can wound the pride or degrade the character of an independent nation which we do not experience," end quote. And then he explains why it is that there's nothing that we haven't experienced that would degrade the national character. He continues, he asks these rhetorical questions about the current system in relation to the ability to raise the troops, pay debts, make treaties, and the depreciation of land value, which I'll explain after this quote. He states, and I quote, "Is commerce of importance to national wealth? Ours is at the lowest point of declension. Is respectability in the eyes of foreign powers a safeguard against foreign encroachments? The imbecility of our government even forbids them to treat with us," end quote. So when he says treat with us, he's describing treaties, because the way the federal government was set up at this point, you really could not impose treaties, because the treaties would have to affect the entire country at that time. And since the country was not technically unified, you would have to do it state by state basis. And countries, other opposing nations, would not want to do a state by state basis treaty, because to them that would just be ridiculous and it wouldn't be worth their time. And like I think I said this in one of my very first videos, it also doesn't hold the same weight having a treaty with New Jersey or New York rather than the United States of America. And then the depreciation of land value is because now if you're in a state of chaotic proportion and there is no guarantee, it's almost like the best way to explain it actually is all these people that yell about climate change and say the world's going to end in 12 years. And then you see these same politicians, these rich politicians owning land on islands. For example, Obama's on Martha's Vineyard, which I think is right off the coast of Massachusetts. And if they really believed in a climate change, then they would not have houses on islands, because those islands would be taken over by an influx of water because of the rising water because of the climate change and the polar ice caps melting. And it's the same thing. It relates also to the insurance agencies, and banks too. I mean, banks would not buy any houses on the water if they really. I'm sure that they have their own studies that are related to climate change. They have done their own evaluations, just like they do whenever they put in a pipeline. And in doing their evaluations, they try to figure out if it's a good investment or not to buy that land or buy those houses that are near the shoreline or the coastline. And they continue to buy it up, and they continue to give out insurance at a somewhat reasonable rate. Which means if there was a really, really high chance of that climate change in the next, now at this point 10 years and ending the entire world, they would not be giving out that insurance at such a decent rate. It would be astronomical. It would pretty much be unaffordable, where no one would even own land. No one would be owning land over in those areas, essentially. So that's really what he's saying, is when you are unsure about how the country is working, other countries especially, they're less and less willing to buy land from the United States, and there's a depreciation of value in that land because you're not sure. There's a lot of instability in the market. Kind of what happened with the housing bubble. It's similar to that. It's a way to explain it. Now now he goes on. He continues describing the current situation. I already read that off. And he states, and I quote, "To shorten an enumeration of particulars which can afford neither pleasure nor instruction, it may in general be demanded what indication is there of national disorder, poverty, and insignificance that could befall a community so peculiarly blessed with natural advantages as we are, which does not form a part of the dark catalogue of our public misfortunes." End quote. So that's really, he's saying a question here. He is referring to, look, we have all of these natural resources. We should be very successful. We have natural advantages. We have the eastern seaboard. We have a climate that's good in our southern areas where we can grow crop, and then we have our textiles in the north that we do very well with. We have a lot of ports of entry in which trade can be done. Why is it that there's this national disorder, this poverty, and this insignificance in our country? That's really the question that he's asking. With all these considering factors and these particulars, why are we having all of these issues? And next, he goes on to attack the opposition of the proposed Constitution, saying, pretty much blaming these issues on them, and also blaming it on the current Articles of Confederation. He states, and I quote, "This is the melancholy situation to which we have been brought by those very maxims and counsels which would now deter us from adopting the proposed Constitution, and which, not content with having conducted us to the brink of precipice, seem resolved to plunge us into the abyss that awaits us below. Here, my countrymen, impelled by every motive that ought to influence an enlightened people, let us make a firm stand for our safety, our tranquility, our dignity, our reputation. Let us at last break the fatal charm which has too long seduced us from the paths of felicity and prosperity." End quote. So, like I said, he's going after these people that are against the ratification of the proposed Constitution. He continues on this front, stating, and I quote, "While they admit that the government of the United States is destitute of energy, they contend against conferring upon it those powers which are requisite to supply that energy. They seem still to aim at things repugnant and irreconcilable, at an augmentation of federal authority without a diminution of state authority, at sovereignty in the Union and complete independence in the members. They still, in fine, seem to cherish with blind devotion the political monster of an imperium in imperio." End quote. So here, he goes pretty deep. When he says imperium in imperio, he means a sovereign inside of a sovereign. Now, the difference between a Hamilton and a Madison in their writing and their format, it seems like Madison's a little bit more straightforward with a lot of things he says. In this paper, Hamilton, there's a lot of almost confounding principles, because it seems like he's saying here the augmentation of a federal authority without a diminishing of a state authority, at sovereignty in the Union and complete independence in the members. So some of those things actually of our federal system are true, and I don't know if he's characterizing their arguments, because at the end then he says, a sovereign inside of a sovereign, which, to be honest with you, our federal government, our state governments are supposed to be sovereigns. So, Hamilton was much more authoritarian in his leanings in all of these writings, which is why once the Federalist Papers were done with, Madison and as well as Hamilton, they actually both left and they both took over different parties. I think Hamilton continued to represent the Federalist Party, and then Madison believed that he actually was going too far authoritarian, and he left, and I think it was Madison created the Democratic Republican Party, or he joined that party, which was much more freedom-based and freedom-minded, more conservative in their principles. And then they actually I think they were very successful. The early Republican Party was actually very successful. The party of an Abraham Lincoln. They're very successful in keeping the taxes low. That's really what they were fighting for, a lot of founding principles. But here he's saying, and this is true of either way, whatever he means by it, this is actually true of our federal constitution, where the federal authority is stronger, it's built up, but the state power is still not diminished as much, I guess, as he's trying to allude to as it should be. And there is sovereignty in those states, but still there is a unification of the Union. So I guess it is a complete independence. I guess he is really talking about he's characterizing the objectors here. But he is a little bit, I will be honest, he is a little bit off in terms of the way, I think he's going a little bit overboard with the way he's characterizing and going against his dissenters. But he writes most of these papers, and his leanings, you can tell, are a little bit more towards authoritarian, which at this point maybe he felt like he needed to be very energetic and robust about it, and he needed to be that far into it to try to get people to meet him at some sort of a middle ground. Now, next he states, and I quote, "The great and radical vice in the construction of the existing Confederation is in the principle of legislation for states or governments in their corporate or collective capacities, and as contradistinguished from the individuals of which they consist," end quote. So this actually, he is right. If you read the Articles of Confederation, it was much more of an alliance between the states, because that's here what he is referencing. He's referencing these legislation is for the states and the state governments rather than the people, because the individuals which these state governments consist of really the people that this Constitution is supposed to represent. And it seems much more like an alliance is what he's really saying. So in this new proposed Constitution, the proposal is that it is going to be between the people and the federal government rather than the federal government and the state governments. And I have a couple quotes at the very end of this that will explain why it needs to be that way. Under the Articles of Confederation, like I said, there's no stated government power in relation to these subjects, as in the people. and funding a lot of the other things that are needed, such as raising armies, which he states here, and I quote, "Except as to the rule of appointment, the United States has an indefinite discretion to make requisitions for men and money, but they have no authority to raise either by regulations extending to the individual citizens of America. The consequence of this is that though in theory their resolutions concerning those objects are laws constitutionally binding on the members of the Union, yet in practice they are mere recommendations which the states observe or disregard at their option." End quote. This is very important. This is very significant. This paper in general is actually, I think it's pretty underrated because it does point to the very first fundamental flaw of the Articles of Confederation, the fact that it was much more of an alliance between the states rather than a contract directly with the people and the federal government. So here what he's saying is when they go to make those requisitions for money and for men for the military, these states they have their discretion to either say go pound salt or yeah, sure, we'll help you out. And most of the time what ended up happening was they said go pound salt because they had their own state militias and they didn't want to have to give revenues to the federal government as they had their own problems that they had to worry about, their own civil lists, like from a couple papers ago that I was mentioning. Now, Hamilton goes on to explain how ridiculous an alliance of nations would be, and then he explains Europe as an example, because in the early 1700s, there was a lot of alliances that just did not last, and they continued to fight each other. If you think about between Spain, France, and Great Britain alone, France helped us get Great Britain off of our backs in the Revolutionary War, and then I think, what was there? There was the Spanish-American War in the 1700s before. I think that was actually before the Revolutionary War, the Spanish-American War, and then there's the War of 1812 after all that, so it's just constant fighting. It's constant fighting in Europe. They were just fighting each other like crazy all the time. And he continues. Oh, wait. He's got another thing here. Now, he characterizes this, and I quote, "This would bring us to a simple alliance, offensive and defensive, and would place us in a situation to be alternate friends and enemies of each other, as our mutual jealousies and rivalships, nourished by the intrigues of foreign nations, should prescribe us." End quote. So this harps back to the point that these foreign countries are going to try to get involved, and having this simple alliance will cause factions and infighting, and it won't do anything. There's no real union behind it because everyone is not everybody has a slice of the pie. Not everybody has some skin in the game because there is, like I said, there's that mutual commerce. And when that's not going on and you have completely different sovereign states, there's going to be more infighting. Now, he continues, and I quote, "But if we are unwilling to be placed in this perilous situation, if we still will adhere to the design of a national government, or which is the same thing of superintending power under the direction of a common council, we must resolve to incorporate into our plan those ingredients which may be considered as forming the characteristic difference between a league and a government. We must extend the authority of the Union to the persons of the citizens, the only proper objects of government," end quote. So he's stating the citizens are the only proper objects of government, meaning they're the only things that the government even relates to. Because if we tell a state government they need to do this for their people, the state governors or the state legislature can just tell the federal government to go, like I say, go take a long walk off a short pier. They could just not care about whatever the federal government has to say. So this federal contract needs to be between the people and the federal government, and that's why they have the proposed constitution. The proposed constitution is really a contract between the people as well as the federal government, even though the federal government is supposed to be of the people. And there are certain rights, there are a lot of rights that are afforded to the people, and then there's certain rights that are enumerated and afforded to the government. Now, Hamilton stresses that the government must have power to enforce the law, otherwise it is just advice, and the lack of order will cause factions. Now, this is very critical here, this part. If this were the case under the current government governing document, the Articles of Confederation, it will be enforced through the means of a military power of factional power, which will create a dangerous precedent leading to anarchy and instability. Now, he explains this principle, and I quote, "Government implies the power of making laws. It is essential to the idea of a law that it must be attended with a sanction, or in other words, a penalty or punishment for disobedience. If there be no penalty annexed to disobedience, the resolutions or commands which pretend to be laws will in fact amount to nothing more than advice or recommendation. This penalty, whatever it may be, can only be inflicted in two ways: by the agency of the courts and ministers of justice, or by the military force, by the coercion of the magistrate, or by the coercion of arms," end quote. So what he's referring to here is, we need a court system, because when governments go rogue, state governments go rogue, or even when people go rogue, we need to be able to enforce those laws. And you can either enforce the law by one of two ways: through a court system, a magistrate, which he's meaning a judge, or through arms, through physical force. And you would much rather have it go through a justice system, just like, for example, everything that's going on currently with the Trump team and the Trump administration with their litigation in court. That's why it's weird when all these pundits and all these anchors are going, "Oh, he's trying to overthrow the democracy. He's doing authoritarian, dictatorial actions." A dictator and an authoritarian, somebody like a Stalin, somebody that's Stalin-esque or a Hitler-esque character, what they would do in this scenario, if they lost the election anointed by the media and they thought the numbers were off, their instant reaction would not be to run to the court system. Their first reaction would be they would mobilize the military and they would shut everybody down and say, "I'm not leaving. This is my position, and I will not leave from that position." So going to the court systems, the civil, and if you want to talk about democracy, that's the most, I don't even want to call it democratic way of doing it, but that's the fairest way to do it. I just don't like when they always use, and I'm sure it's a focus group tested term, and I hate when Republicans do it too, and they keep saying our democracy as if we are not a republic. They make it like we are a pure democracy all the time. The way in which we vote is democratic, and that's really it. Nothing else is a democracy about our government other than the way in which we elect our representatives. It's a representative republic, and those representatives are democratically elected, as in the people vote on those representatives. Then the representatives go and they vote on other things that are related to us. Like I said, it's supposed to really set up multiple safeguards. You're supposed to have the president that safeguards our rights, as well as the Congress, the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate, and then you also have the Supreme Court system. They are all set up in certain ways. They have their own little safeguards to protect our freedoms. That's really the point in our system. That's why I hate when they go and they say it's a democracy, because it's not. Because if it was a democracy, if we want to get rid of guns tomorrow, we would just have a vote on it through the people. We would have whatever the popularity vote was, and we would just go and we would get rid of a constitutional amendment. That's why we are not a democracy, because a democracy goes by the will of the majority all of the time. If the majority wants to take the rights away from the minority. So in a complete pure democracy, if we really wanted to, and this is why it did not work in Europe, and this is why we have a representative republic, if we wanted to get rid of all the Christians in the country, we would have a pure democracy vote on it, and that would just be it. It would overthrow the Constitution, because there would be no rights afforded in the Constitution, because it would be a pure democracy where those can just be easily voted away. Not a constitutional republic. That's why we call it a constitutional republic, because there's rights that are afforded in that constitution rather than a democracy. That's why I hate when any pundits, you get the Jake Tapper or what have you, these narcissistic and what would you call them, rather smug, arrogant people that go on TV and say he's trying to overthrow our democracy. Guess what? If Stalin lost an election, that's not what would be done. It would be instantly mobilize the military. They were under my rule, and I will put my boot on the throat of anybody that disagrees with me. I am still the president. That's what would happen if he was really trying to overthrow our democracy. Now, he stresses, Hamilton, that this court system will be supplemented by the government in terms of money and force. He remarks, and I quote, In an association where the general authority is confined to the collective bodies of the communities that compose it, every breach of the laws must involve a state of war, and military execution must become the only instrument of civil disobedience, end quote. So here he's really just building some foundation on his argument from before, where the military, if you don't have a court system, the only way in which to enforce the rules or the law is to use military power. That's why you're much better off settling it in the courts. Really, that's the main theme here, and it is very important and significant. It's a very essential element to our republic that we have in our Constitution. Now, Hamilton begins to talk about the common agreement and knowledge that states would not break the rules of the federal government, which at this point they have been doing. To this he responds, and I quote, "Why has government been instituted at all? Question mark. Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. Has it been found that bodies of men act with more rectitude or greater disinterestedness than individuals? The contrary of this has been inferred by all accurate observers of the conduct of mankind, and the inference is founded upon obvious reasons. Regard to reputation has a less active influence when the infamy of a bad action is to be divided among a number than when it is to fall singly upon one. A spirit of faction, which is apt to mingle its poison in the deliberations of all bodies of men, will often hurry the persons of whom they are composed into improprieties and excesses for which they would blush in a private capacity," end quote. So this one's a really long one. He goes on really what he's saying here, and see that's why, like I said, he seems a little bit more authoritarian, especially more than Madison, when he says, what does he say here that's exactly just without constraint? Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. So meaning that they need to be restrained in some way, or there needs to be ramifications for their actions, or else they will not follow rules, and there will be no justice. Which, I mean, he's kind of right, but the way in which he says it is just kind of a little bit too overbearing, a little too over the top, in my opinion. Now, what he says, what's important about this is that this will shut down, and this is true. If you, I mean, when you were a kid, whenever you had that one kid that came up to fight, or whoever's ever been part of a jumping, people are much stronger in numbers. They have more, have a little bit more indignation, I guess you would say, or they're more willing to do things when they have a group behind them. They feel more confident. If you've ever been jumped before when you were in school, it's always a group of people, but then if that same person that decided to start the jumping saw you one-on-one in person, they wouldn't do anything about it. That's really exactly what Hamilton is saying here. Now, he ends his paper talking about the inefficiencies of the Articles of Confederation, more distinctly with the state governments. Now, he explains the fears of giving the power of the federal government enforcement to that of the state. So meaning the federal government will set a tone or set a standard, and that enforcement is contingent upon the state governments to carry it out. Now, in addition to all this, there is... and I quote, "In addition to all this, there is in the nature of sovereign power an impatience of control that disposes those who are invested with the exercise of it to look with an evil eye upon all external attempts to restrain or direct its operations. From this spirit it happens that in every political association which is formed upon the principle of uniting in a common interest a number of lesser sovereignties, there will be found a kind of eccentric tendency in the subordinate or inferior orbs, by the operation of which there will be a perpetual effort in each to fly off from the common center. This tendency is not difficult to be accounted for. It has its origin in the love of power. Power controlled or abridged is almost always the rival and enemy of that power by which it is controlled or abridged. This simple proposition will teach us how little reason there is to expect that the persons entrusted with the administration of the affairs of the particular members of a confederacy will at all times be ready, with perfect good humor and an unbiased regard to the public weal, to execute the resolutions or decrees of the general authority. The reverse of this results from the constitution of human nature." End quote. So when he says public weal, he means like the public welfare. Weal was, I guess, another way to say public welfare years ago. So he's pretty much saying if you give that power to the state governments to regulate or follow through with federal government actions, they're going to actually abuse that power because they're given extra powers now will be afforded to them that are really federal government jurisdiction and federal government powers. Now then he states the other side of the argument, which he states, and I quote, "If therefore the measures of the Confederacy cannot be executed without the intervention of the particular administrations, there will be little prospect of their being executed at all. The rulers of the respective members, whether they have a constitutional right to do it or not, will undertake to judge of the propriety of the measures themselves. They will consider the conformity of the thing proposed or required to their immediate interests or aims, the momentary conveniences or inconveniences that would attend its adoption, and this will be done, and in a spirit of interest and suspicious scrutiny, without that knowledge of national circumstances and reasons of state which is essential to a right judgment, and with that strong predilection in favor of local objects which can hardly fail to mislead the decision." End quote. Now, that's exactly what he's saying here. Is state governments can just decide not to execute what the federal government tells them to in this current this Articles of Confederation, because they have their discretion to choose to enforce the rules or not, and they will do whatever is best for them. So particularly in terms of taxation, which I think he goes on to explain this next. It's the very last quote. But he explains in terms of taxation, if you're a smaller state, you're much more willing to pay taxes to, I guess, that federal government that Congress assembled, because you actually need the help from them because you are a small state. So you're going to pay those taxes, you're going to build up revenue for them, right? But if you're that small state, you're the only state that is getting taxed. So like your government, if the federal government's saying, "Hey, we have the right," and they don't even have an actual specific imposition in terms of taxation. Like they don't have a percentage, they don't have a number, nothing. This is the Articles of Confederation, this is how it worked. They just said, we have the right to tax, but there's no number, there's no set anything. So when they say, "Hey, the war is coming through, we need men and we need revenues," let's say we're going to tax everything at 3%, every single sale that happens, like a sales tax. We're going to tax it at 3%. They tell all these states, right? And there's an alliance between the states. Now, since there is not a court system, like you said before, states can just say, screw off and not do anything about it and not tax and not give men for wars, which are needed. And then the smaller states, because they're actually legitimately afraid because they don't have the men, they will pay the tax, and then they get screwed in that deal because they're paying higher impositions probably to make up for the bigger states, and then they become destitute there. They don't have any money left, and these bigger states get away with everything pretty much, and they just kind of sail off into the sunset. That's why you needed the union, so you can collect all of that revenue together. And there was an actual imposition, and there was a court system, less than there was, like, for example, with our NATO, when Trump was ripping everybody, because I think NATO, each nation in there, has to pay something like 2% of whatever their GDP is into the organization. And no one was doing it except for Luxembourg, because Luxembourg has an insane amount of wealth per capita. I think they're actually the richest country in the entire world, but they're also very small. I mean, they're right next to Germany. It's like this little. It's the size of maybe if I had to guess, probably the size of maybe like New Jersey. I mean, it's small, and I think they have a lot of natural resources in the area. I'm not exactly sure. But other than them, America was the only one, and I think America was paying something like 3%. So we were overpaying, and everybody else was underpaying, which is why when Trump went to the NATO conference, he just ripped them a new one. And then I think I don't know if he ever dropped out of the UN, but he's ripping them a new one too because no one pays. The UN is just so everybody knows, the UN's a giant joke. It is full of a bunch of these Middle Eastern countries that commit some of the hugest human rights violations every single year, and it's comprised of mostly those countries that commit all these human rights violations. So the UN is just a giant trash heap. It is a giant hypocrisy, and it's a joke. Anyone that is informed knows that. Anyone that reads knows that it's just a big joke. It's so the bureaucracy or all these national leaders can just kind of get together and just, I guess, bathe in their own narcissism. I don't really know, and have these funny tags that say, president of this place or prime minister of Great Britain, and like they're big shots. That's really what it's for. And I don't know. I saw this weird thing. There's these other countries right now. I don't know. I think it was Japan I was looking at. They were in the streets with like Trump flags and faces of Trump. I don't remember if it was Japan. I don't know. But it seems like that Donald Trump, and this was another thing in Hong Kong, when the Chinese government was trying to overtake Hong Kong and eventually ended up taking them over. The people were out in the streets with waving American flags. I think that's the same thing that happened in. It was the same thing going on in Venezuela when they were trying to overthrow Maduro, and I think they never got it done. But it's just America is considered this beacon of hope and freedom, and I think sometimes I won't say sometimes, but I think very often it is something that isn't appreciated. We take it for granted. It's not appreciated as much as it should be. I'm not asking everyone to suppress their speech against the United States or against the government, but I'm just saying it's not appreciated the same extent that it should be. I think there's just a lot of negativity out there. I'm not exactly sure why. I think a lot of people are angry because there is the internet now, so you can see what other people that are successful, what they're doing. And because of that, there's a lot of jealousy that I think stems from that. And instead of trying to do better and using it as inspiration, when you see someone else doing very well, people take it personally and they shame or they hate those people for doing that. Like, for example, I know Bezos gets a lot of crap because he makes an insane amount of money. I mean, he's worth like $70 billion. I said in the last video or 2 videos ago that he's doubled his wealth over this COVID-19 thing, and he's legitimately doubled his wealth at Amazon, and he's been just throwing money into the company like crazy. I mean, he owns some stock, but he doesn't really even pull money out. He just continues to invest in the company, which is why he does not pay federal income tax to the same extent that everybody else is paying it, which people don't understand. And that's all, like I said, that's all the tax plan. That's all written into the rules. There's nothing he's doing against the rules. And another thing with him is he doesn't even lobby like people give that guy such a hard time. Then there's all these other companies that lobby hardcore and try to really get their things pushed through. And that guy, I'm pretty sure he doesn't even need to lobby. He's almost, he's undeniable. The company is undeniable. You get your stuff in like 2 days or 1 day sometimes. You get some of the best price. Whatever you search, most likely you can find it on that website. And like I said, I just think it's very interesting that everything that's gone on over the last couple months, how these Democrat governors shut down the states, pretty much taking money from small businesses and just handing it to the big businesses, but then turning around and yelling about in the Congress, like AOC's yelling about how small businesses need relief, and it's like the small businesses wouldn't need relief if it weren't for you guys shutting down all your states and then allowing the big corporations to stay open. I mean, who is the party of the little guy at this point? I mean, who is it? That's all I'm saying. Now, he ends this paper stating, and I quote, "The greater deficiencies of some states furnish the pretext of example and the temptation of interest to the complying or to the least delinquent states. Why should we do more in proportion than those who are embarked with us in the same political voyage? Why should we consent to bear more than our proper share of the common burden? These were suggestions which human selfishness could not withstand, and which even speculative men who looked forward to remote consequences could not without hesitation combat, each state yielding to the persuasive voice of immediate interest or convenience has successively withdrawn its support till the frail and tottering edifice seems ready to fall upon our heads and to crush us beneath its ruins." End quote. Here he is characterizing the state governments in paying the taxes that are needed, and other state governments are looking around and they're going, okay, well, if New Jersey's looking at New York and saying, okay, if New York isn't paying, I'm not paying either. And then Pennsylvania's looking at New York and going, oh, New York and New Jersey aren't paying. Okay, well, I'm not going to be paying either. So that's pretty much what he's alluding to here. And then he's saying they're successively withdrawing their support, and to the point where it all eventually will fall on our heads and crush us in ruins, meaning the country will be in disunion, disarray, it will be in chaos, and we will eventually be taken over. That's really what he's alluding to. So in this paper, to wrap it all up, he makes it abundantly clear in this paper what the theme will be for the papers to come, and he shows his true disdain for the current Articles of Confederation, and as well as the disdain for his dissenters. So that really wraps this one up here. Please like, share, subscribe. This was a pretty long one. It was in depth. It was very deep. Now, if you want to email me any concerns, any ideas for future videos, anything like that, I'm maybe going to be coming out with something over the weekend. We'll see what happens, depending on the current events, the way in which they go. And that's really it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Everyone have a good weekend. If I don't see you, I will see everybody on Monday.